Elias stood at the threshold of the grand ballroom, his presence drawing every eye in the room. He was a man who understood the architecture of a sentence better than any builder understood stone. To Elias, words were the fabric of his power, the currency he traded for loyalty, and the weapons he used to keep rivals at bay. He had spent a lifetime refining his wit, ensuring every observation was sharp as a razor. He prided himself on swaying a crowd or silencing a room with a well-timed pause. Each syllable was a calculated movement in a grand game he believed he was winning. Yet, in his confidence, Elias forgot a fundamental truth. He viewed his tongue as a tool for control, failing to see it as a torch that could burn down his own house. The gala was a high-stakes arena where reputations were broken over crystal glasses. It was the evening Elias lived for, a stage where his social mastery could be displayed. As he moved through the throng, he felt the rush of being the most interesting man in the room. He was surrounded by the elite, people hanging on his every word. In this atmosphere of ego, Elias felt pressure to maintain his standing. He was the conductor of this social symphony, and he refused to let the music falter. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. This moment of supreme influence was what he always desired, yet it was the precipice from which he was about to fall. Conversation turned toward his business partner and closest friend, Julian. They had built their empire together, a bond forged in shared ambition and trust. However, as investors probed into their latest venture, Elias felt a need to distance himself from Julian's shadow. A financier questioned if the partnership was slowing down. Elias, stung by the implication that he was tied to someone less visionary, felt the urge to assert dominance. He wanted to prove he was in control, holding all the cards. In a moment of reckless pride, driven by the intoxicating atmosphere and a need to protect his ego, Elias leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He began to weave a narrative as false as it was devastating. He spoke of irregularities in Julian's accounts, hinting at instability that did not exist. He didn't just speak the words, he performed them, using subtle gestures to give his lies the gravity of truth. He watched as the faces of investors shifted to concern and cold calculation. He felt a dark thrill, believing he was shaping reality with the force of his speech. He told himself it was tactical, a way to ensure he remained the focus of their trust. He ignored the voice of conscience, warning him he was betraying a man who would have died for him. To Elias, words were just tools, and he was the master craftsman. What he failed to grasp was the spiritual weight of his actions. Words are like seeds carried on a restless wind. Once they leave the mouth, they are no longer under control. They find soil in the minds of others, growing into something far larger than the breath that birthed them. The whispers would travel through the city before the sun rose, becoming an unstoppable tide. Elias was planting a garden of thorns, believing he was arranging a bouquet. He thought he could retract the rumor whenever it suited him, but a spoken lie is like a broken vessel. The contents are spilled, and no amount of regret can gather them back. The energy he released was a living force, a destructive power already dismantling a life's work. As his fabrication hung in the air, Elias felt an inexplicable chill. He turned his head, his heart skipping a beat. Standing just a few feet away, obscured by white lilies, was Julian. He was holding a glass, his knuckles white. Julian's face was a portrait of utter, soul-crushing betrayal. He had heard everything. He had watched his best friend dismantle his character for a social victory. The pain in Julian's eyes was a mirror, reflecting the monster Elias had become in his pursuit of vanity. Julian didn't say a word, but the silence was louder than any accusation. The silence carried the weight of a funeral, marking the death of an era and the beginning of the ruin Elias's tongue had set in motion. The morning did not bring the clarity Elias expected. Instead, it brought a suffocating atmosphere of consequences. By 8 o'clock, the digital landscape was flooded with the poison he had released at the gala. Julian's name, once synonymous with integrity, was being dragged through the mud of public opinion. It was a digital wildfire, fueled by the very people who had toasted Julian's health only hours before. Elias sat in his study, the mahogany desk feeling colder than usual. He watched his phone light up with messages from stakeholders, all asking for confirmation of the financial instability he had hinted at. Instead of retracting, the pride that had sustained him for years took the helm. He began to draft emails, careful and calculated, adding layers to the deception. He convinced himself that if he stopped now, he would be ruined along with Julian. To save his own skin, he continued to flay his friend's reputation, unaware that every keystroke was a nail in the coffin of his own peace. A physical manifestation of his guilt began to take shape. It started as a dull ache behind his sternum, a pressure that felt like he had swallowed a leaden weight. When he spoke, his voice sounded different to his own ears, hollower, as if the words were struggling to climb over the obstruction in his chest. This was the heavy tongue, a spiritual burden taking root in his anatomy. He tried to drown the sensation in expensive wine and louder music, but the silence of his empty house only amplified the thumping of his heart against that internal stone. He was becoming a prisoner within his own body, his once prized eloquence turning into a chain that bound him to his lies. Each time he attempted to breathe through the stress, the sensation of iron pressing against his lungs intensified, a constant reminder that the air he breathed was now tainted by the dishonesty he had manufactured. The domestic fallout was equally agonizing. Elias's daughter, who had always viewed her father as a titan of truth, confronted him in the foyer. Her engagement to Julian's son was the casualty of this war. "They say Julian is a thief, Father," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They say his family is disgraced. Is it true? Did you see the books?" Elias looked at his daughter, the person he loved most in the world, and felt the weight in his chest surge. To admit the truth was to lose her respect forever. To lie was to keep her, but at the cost of her future happiness. He chose the lie. He looked her in the eye and nodded, the words tasting like ash. The light in her eyes extinguished instantly, replaced by a shadow of profound grief. The fracture between the families was now complete, a jagged canyon carved by a few moments of vanity at a party. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Elias scheduled a confrontation with the remaining board members. He believed he could still talk his way out of the mess. However, every explanation he offered only spiraled into further complexity. He was caught in a web of his own spinning, where one fabrication required 3 more to sustain it. The more he spoke, the more the air in the room seemed to thin. His associates looked at one another with growing doubt, their trust eroding with every syllable he uttered. The elder, a man of profound spiritual insight who had mentored Elias in his youth, appeared at the edge of the meeting. He didn't speak until the room cleared of the frantic executives. "The tongue holds the power of life and death, Elias," the elder said, his gaze piercing through Elias's facade. "You are breathing death into everything you touch. You think you are winning, but you are suffocating on your own breath. The weight of your words is no longer a metaphor. It is a sentence you have passed upon yourself." The week culminated in a public defense at the town hall. The community was reeling from the sudden collapse of Julian's company, which had provided hundreds of jobs. Elias stood before a sea of expectant faces, his notes laid out before him. This was his stage. He needed to deliver the performance of a lifetime to solidify his narrative and emerge as the sole survivor of the wreckage. He stepped to the microphone, sensing the tension in the room. He saw Julian's son standing near the exit, his face a mask of grief and fury. Elias opened his mouth to begin his prepared speech, but no sound emerged. He tried again, pushing with his diaphragm, but the weight in his throat had become an impenetrable wall. He was a master of words who had suddenly been stripped of his medium. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy, as Elias stood humiliated before the world, his mouth moving in a silent, desperate plea for the voice he had so carelessly misused. The crowd began to murmur in confusion, watching the once great orator crumble into a speechless shell of a man. Elias sat in the sterile white room of a specialist's office, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the space. Doctors had run every possible test, yet the results remained clear. There was no physical obstruction, no biological reason for the void where his voice used to be. The lead physician suggested it was psychogenic, a reaction to extreme stress. But Elias knew the truth was deeper. It was as if the universe had accepted his silent plea for dominance and revoked his permit to speak. The silence was not medical. It was a cosmic intervention, a spiritual gag placed upon a man who could no longer be trusted with the power of breath. His descent into irrelevance was swift. Without his ability to command a room, Elias became a liability. His followers, those who had hung on his words at the gala, vanished like morning mist. Phones stopped ringing and invitations dwindled to nothing. In the vacuum of his presence, new rumors circulated, many far more unkind than the ones he had fabricated about Julian. He was no longer the brilliant leader. He was a broken man. A cautionary tale whispered about in the hallways where he had once reigned supreme. His influence had been built on air, and now that his lungs could no longer produce the currency of his trade, the structure was collapsing. Forced into this involuntary monasticism, Elias discovered that silence was far from empty. It was filled with echoes. In the stillness of his study, he began to hear the ghosts of his own voice, the casual cruelty of a joke at a colleague's expense, and the jagged lies he had used to climb the social ladder. These were spiritual hauntings. He saw the faces of those he had stepped on, their hurt now vivid and unavoidable. Every word he had ever spoken seemed to return to him like birds of prey. He realized that for decades, he had used language as a shield to keep the world at bay, never once stopping to consider the emotional debris he left in his wake. His grand estate began to feel like a mausoleum. The high ceilings and cold marble floors amplified every footfall, reminding him he was utterly alone. His daughter had moved out, unable to bear the suffocating quiet. She couldn't look at him without seeing the man who had destroyed her future with a single, calculated nod of betrayal. Elias wandered through empty rooms at night, the leaden sensation in his chest growing heavier. He was a prisoner in a tomb of his own making, surrounded by the luxury his words had bought, but unable to enjoy any of it because the spirit of the house had died along with his voice. During a particularly cold night, a shift occurred. He had been viewing the silence as a curse, a brutal punishment. But watching the dying embers, he wondered if it was actually a hidden mercy. If he could still speak, he would only continue to lie. The silence was a mandatory fast for his soul, a spiritual detox stripping away his ego. He started to lean into the stillness, finally listening to the world around him. The rustle of the wind, the creak of the house, and the honest beat of his own heart. It was a cleansing of the spirit and a slow rebirth. The isolation was broken by a courier bearing a single envelope. Julian, bankrupt and broken by the rumors, was preparing to leave the country. He was moving across the ocean, seeking a life where the stains on his reputation couldn't follow him. Julian was selling his few remaining assets and would likely never return. Elias felt a surge of panic followed by a terrifying clarity. This was his final window for redemption. He had to choose, remain in his silent tomb, or find a way to make amends before the man he had betrayed vanished forever. The weight in his chest throbbed with a new intensity, no longer the ache of guilt, but the urgent pulse of a man who understood that his life depended on the one truth he had spent a lifetime trying to hide. It was a desperate race against time. The road to the mountain monastery was a path that seemed to lead away from everything Elias had ever known. The journey began with the slow, rhythmic hum of tires against asphalt, eventually giving way to the crunch of gravel as he climbed toward the heavens. The mountain air was sharp, biting at his lungs with a cold purity that felt like a silent rebuke to the stale, manufactured atmosphere of the city galas he had once commanded. He left his car at the base of a narrow stone path, carrying only a small bag and the heavy, invisible burden that had replaced his voice. Each step upward was a physical manifestation of his internal struggle, a slow ascent away from the ruins of his reputation and toward an uncertain sanctuary. The monastery sat perched on a granite ledge, a cluster of ancient stone buildings that seemed to have grown naturally from the earth itself. There was no bell to greet him, only the profound stillness of the high peaks where the wind whispered secrets that required no translation. Upon entering the arched wooden gates, Elias was met by a man whose face was etched with the deep lines of a life lived in contemplation. This was Brother Malachi. He did not offer a handshake or a formal greeting. Instead, he gestured for Elias to follow him into a small, sun-drenched courtyard. Malachi carried a small slate chalkboard tethered to his waist by a cord. With a piece of chalk that looked as though it had seen decades of use, he wrote 5 words that struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. "Silence is the fence around wisdom." Elias stared at the script, the chalk dust catching in the afternoon light. For a man who had spent his entire life tearing down fences with his rhetoric and bypassing boundaries with his charm, the idea of a protective barrier made of stillness was revolutionary. Malachi pointed to a simple stone bench and then to the vast horizon, signaling that the first lesson would not be found in books or lectures, but in the observation of the wordless world. Days bled into one another as Elias was tasked with a singular spiritual exercise, to watch and listen to the unvoiced. He sat for hours by a small mountain stream, observing how the cold water moved over the stones. The water did not announce its arrival or boast of its strength. It simply flowed, shaping the landscape through persistent, quiet presence. He watched the ancient pines sway in the wind, their slow growth a silent testament to endurance and hidden strength. He began to realize that the most powerful forces in the universe, gravity, the rising sun, the turning of the seasons, operated without a single syllable. In the city, Elias had used words to build a kingdom of ego, a fragile castle of influence that required constant verbal maintenance to keep from crumbling. Here, under the watchful, compassionate gaze of Malachi, he understood that his eloquence had been a tool for service to himself, never to the truth. His words had been a noise designed to drown out the terrifying reality of his own inner void. The internal restraint required for this life was agonizing. There were moments when the pressure in his chest became so intense he felt he might explode from the weight of unsaid things. He wanted to scream out his frustrations, to explain his side of the story to Malachi, to beg for a quick fix that would restore his voice and his former life. But Malachi would only point to the chalkboard or offer a steadying hand. Elias had to learn to sit with his discomfort, to let the waves of guilt and panic wash over him without trying to talk his way out of them. He discovered that when you cannot speak, you are forced to actually feel the texture of your soul. The layers of rationalization he had used to justify his betrayal of Julian were slowly stripped away, leaving behind a raw, uncomfortable honesty. He was learning the ultimate form of self-mastery, the ability to govern the impulse to react, to judge, and to deceive. The peace of the monastery was shattered late one afternoon by a scent that did not belong in the high, crisp air. The smell of acrid smoke drifted over the granite peaks, followed by a hazy orange glow that began to lick at the southern horizon. A forest fire, fueled by a dry season and shifting winds, was racing up the slope toward the sanctuary. The bells of the monastery finally rang, a frantic, clanging alarm that broke the sacred quiet. The monks moved with practiced urgency, but the main path to the valley was already being choked by thick black clouds. Elias looked at Malachi, seeing the gravity and concern in the old man's eyes. The fire was moving faster than any of them could run. In that moment of terror, Elias realized he was the only one who had scouted the northern ridge the day before. He knew a way out, a narrow trail that led to safety, but he had no voice to call for attention, no way to shout directions over the roar of the encroaching flames. He had to find a way to lead them, but his only tool was the very silence he was still learning to inhabit. The orange glow became a wall of heat, and the roar of the fire was like 1,000 hungry beasts. Elias watched the monks looking at the smoke-choked path with growing desperation. He stood in the courtyard, his heart hammering. He could not scream. He could not shout for them to follow or explain that the northern ridge was clear. He was trapped in the silence he had come to study. But as Brother Malachi caught his eye, Elias did not see panic. He saw an invitation. The monk gestured toward the confusion, and Elias understood that his leadership did not require a megaphone. He grabbed a wooden staff and moved with a rhythmic pace toward the monastery rear. He walked with a steady stride that drew eyes. He looked back, meeting the gaze of the monks, and pointed toward the rocky spine of the northern ridge. He became a living beacon. By using broad gestures and maintaining calm, he signaled for the community to gather supplies. When a novice froze in terror as a tree exploded, Elias did not bark an order. He simply walked over, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, and looked into his eyes with a peace the fire could not touch. The boy breathed and followed. They climbed the ridge in a silent procession against the orange sky. Elias led them through narrow crevices he had explored hours before. He was no longer the man who manipulated words. He was a man whose presence served as a compass. By the time dawn broke, they reached the safety of the damp hollows. The monks were alive because of a man who had not uttered a sound. As the sun rose, the heavy weight in Elias's chest began to dissolve. It melted like wax near a flame. He opened his mouth not to test his vocal cords, but to breathe. "We are safe," he whispered. The words felt heavy, like stones from a deep well. His voice was no longer the sharp instrument of social dominance. It was lower, resonant, and carried an intentionality that made the monks turn in awe. It was the first time they heard him speak, and the sound carried the gravity of the mountain. Brother Malachi smiled and nodded once. The lesson was complete. Before leaving, Elias stood at the stone altar. He made a silent covenant. He would never again speak a word that did not improve upon the silence. He would no longer use his gift to build monuments to his ego. He descended the mountain not as a fallen leader seeking to reclaim a throne, but as a student of the truth. The city felt different. The air was thick with the noise of shallow conversations. His former life was in shambles. His house was quiet, and his name was a punchline. At a market, he was spotted by former associates. They were the people who had once fed on his gossip. They swarmed him, hoping for a new scandal. They baited him with insults about his lost year, trying to provoke the old Elias into a defensive rage. Elias simply looked at them. He felt the urge to craft a biting retort, but he stayed his tongue. He let their words hang in the air, powerless. His silence was a shield of mastery. He realized that he who guards his mouth keeps his life. The crowd grew uncomfortable, their taunts dying out. They walked away, confused by the man who no longer needed to win. However, the peace was short-lived. Elias overheard a hushed conversation that Julian, his former partner, was being investigated for financial fraud. The rumors Elias had started had grown into a legal monster that now threatened to consume Julian's future. The influence Elias once used to protect his own reputation had left a trail of false evidence pointing squarely at Julian's throat. Julian was being framed for a crime Elias had indirectly facilitated through his old, reckless whispers. The weight returned to Elias's chest as an urgent call to action. His silence had saved his soul, but now his voice would be required to save an innocent man's life. He discovered that the court trial was set to begin within a single week. The atmosphere in the courtroom was stifling, thick with the scent of old wood and the electric tension of a life hanging in the balance. Julian did not even look up when Elias entered. He seemed resigned to his fate, a man crushed by the world he had helped build. Elias felt the weight of every syllable he had ever uttered in malice. The prosecution was currently painting a picture of Julian as a master manipulator, using the very phrases Elias had coined during that fateful gala months ago. It was a surreal experience for Elias to hear his own lies echoed back to him through the mouth of a legal professional. Stripped of their wit and presented as cold, hard facts, he realized then that words are not just seeds, they are also shadows that can grow long enough to darken a man's entire existence. During the afternoon recess, Elias found himself cornered in a dimly lit side corridor by a former business associate. This man, a shadow of Elias's own past, spoke with a hurried conspiratorial tone. He told Elias that there was a way to maintain the current trajectory without any further damage to their shared interests. He suggested that if Elias simply remained a spectator, the legal system would do the work for them. Julian would be the scapegoat. The books would be closed, and Elias could quietly slide back into a position of power once the dust settled. The associate's words were a seductive melody of the old life, offering safety and status in exchange for a final, permanent betrayal. Elias looked into the man's eyes and saw the hollowness of his own previous life. He recognized the trap of a silence used for concealment rather than contemplation. He did not offer a rebuttal. He simply turned and walked back toward the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, his silence now a deliberate choice of rejection. When the court reconvened, the air seemed to vibrate with an unspoken demand for resolution. The judge, a woman with eyes as sharp as flint, presided over the bench with a weary authority. When the defense called for a surprise witness, the room held its collective breath. Elias stood and walked toward the witness stand. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried a weight that made the gallery fall into a profound silence. As he placed his hand on the Bible, he felt a strange sense of liberation. The oath he took was not merely a legal formality, it was a continuation of the covenant he had made on the mountain. Elias began to speak. His voice was different now, devoid of the performative flourishes and sharp-edged wit that had once been his trademark. It was a low, steady cadence that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards of the room. He did not defend himself. He did not offer excuses or attempt to pivot the blame. Instead, he meticulously dismantled the architecture of lies he had built. He explained the origin of the rumors, the specific moments of fabrication, and the evidence he had withheld to protect his own crumbling reputation. He detailed how his own words had been weaponized against Julian, taking full responsibility for the financial discrepancies that were now being used as shackles. The clarity of his confession was devastating. The power of his honesty, stripped of all artifice, was more persuasive than his years of eloquent deception could ever have been. In the gallery, people leaned forward, captivated by a man who was willingly burning his own house down to save another. The judge watched him with a growing intensity, recognizing the rare sound of a soul speaking without a mask. Elias felt the physical sensation of the heavy tongue finally leaving him, replaced by the terrifying, beautiful lightness of the truth. As he finished his testimony, he looked at Julian. For the first time in months, their eyes met, and the shock in Julian's gaze began to soften into something Elias had forgotten he deserved to see, the beginning of understanding. The courtroom remained in a stunned, absolute silence, a silence Elias had finally learned how to honor. In that stillness, Elias felt no fear of his impending sentence, only peace of soul aligned with the truth. The judge's gavel fell with finality. Julian was exonerated, his name cleared by the raw weight of the truth. Julian stood, legs trembling from the sudden release of tension. He walked toward Elias, who remained in the witness stand, exhausted yet liberated. No grand speeches were offered, words had already done enough damage. Instead, Julian reached out, and the two men shared a long, silent embrace. It was a bridge built over a chasm of betrayal, held by the strength of forgiveness. In that wordless contact, the debt was settled, and the heavy sensation that had once crushed Elias's chest finally dissolved into the still air of the courtroom. Justice required a price. Elias was sentenced to community service and a suspended sentence, a light burden compared to his past spiritual prison. He surrendered his estate and luxury accounts to settle civil damages, yet he walked away feeling wealthier than ever. The public looked at him with confusion and distant respect. He was no longer the charismatic leader who charmed rooms. He was the man who found the courage to be quiet. He moved into a modest cottage on the city's outskirts, where the rustle of the wind through the leaves was more frequent than any ringing telephone. Years passed, and Elias discovered a deeper calling. He did not return to the podiums of power. Instead, he sat in quiet circles with those haunted by their own words, angry parents and leaders whose tongues had outpaced their integrity. He became a counselor, a guide into the terrain of restraint. He taught that a word left unspoken is a servant, while a word spoken in haste becomes a master. He showed them how to breathe into the silence, helping them understand that the space between a thought and a sentence is where character is born. The restoration of the two families culminated on a fragrant spring afternoon, where the scent of jasmine filled the air. Elias's daughter took the hand of Julian's son beneath a canopy of blossoms. The fracture that once threatened their love had been healed by the man who caused it. Julian stood as the father of the groom, and Elias stood as the father of the bride, their bond forged in shared suffering. During the reception, a hush fell over the guests as Elias rose. They remembered the old Elias, the man who would have spoken for half an hour, weaving metaphors and fishing for laughter with his sharp wit. Elias stood slowly, glass raised. He looked at his daughter, then his new son, and finally at Julian, his brother restored. The room waited in stillness. Elias took a slow breath, honoring the silence. He spoke only one sentence. "May your lives be the beautiful song that your words are too small to describe." He sat down immediately. The simplicity of the toast, delivered with a voice carrying the depth of mountain trails, moved everyone to tears. He no longer needed to dominate with intellect when he could bless the room with simple sincerity. In the twilight of his years, Elias spent his mornings in a small garden, feeling the cool morning dew on his skin. He watched vines climb without sound and flowers open in majestic stillness. He realized that the greatest truths do not shout, they whisper in the quietude of a disciplined soul. He was finally free from the heavy tongue, for he had learned how to guard his heart. The silence was no longer a tomb of isolation, but a sanctuary where he could hear the voice of the divine. Consider the words you have spoken today. Were they seeds of life or shadows of death? We often believe our power lies in our ability to speak, but true maturity is found in the strength to remain silent. Guard your tongue as if it were the gate to your soul, for once a word is released, it can never be retrieved. Find peace in the intentional pause, and remember that the most powerful thing you can ever say is often nothing at all.